The leather cracked against Samuel's back for the 13th time, each strike echoing across the Virginia plantation like thunder before a storm. Master Harrison counted aloud, his voice steady as a preacher's, while blood soaked through the torn fabric of Samuel's shirt. The crime, being caught with a piece of charcoal and bark, practicing letters in the dirt behind the tobacco barn. Harrison had discovered the crude alphabet scratched into the earth, each letter a death sentence in a world where enslaved minds were meant to remain forever dark. Samuel's wife, Ruth, stood among the other enslaved people, forced to watch, her fists clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. Their 8-year-old son, Moses, buried his face in her skirt, but she made herself look. She made herself remember every detail of Harrison's face as he raised the whip again, the way his mouth twisted with something that went beyond duty or discipline into pure pleasure. Harrison paused, breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. He walked around to face Samuel, whose head hung low, but whose eyes burned with an intelligence that had always unsettled the master. Samuel had been born on this plantation, had grown up alongside Harrison's own son, had even saved the boy from drowning in the creek when they were both 12. That closeness had ended abruptly when Harrison inherited the plantation and Samuel's childhood companion became his legal property. The whip fell again and again until Harrison's arm grew tired, but something in Samuel's silence, in the way he absorbed each blow without crying out, made Harrison's victory feel hollow. The enslaved man's body was broken, but his spirit remained uncracked, and that terrified Harrison more than any rebellion. 3 months after the whipping, Samuel's back had healed into a map of raised scars, but his hunger for knowledge had only deepened. Ruth had found him a new teacher, an elderly enslaved woman named Mama Celia, who had learned to read from her previous master's daughter before being sold south. Celia ran what she called night school in the root cellar beneath her cabin, where enslaved people gathered after the overseer's final rounds to share forbidden knowledge. The lessons happened by candlelight. They blew across the plantation grounds. She blew across the plantation grounds. She taught Samuel that words were weapons more powerful than any knife, that knowledge could cut chains no blacksmith had ever forged. Samuel absorbed every lesson with desperate intensity, his calloused fingers tracing letters until they bled, his mind storing every word like ammunition for a war he was still learning how to fight. Ruth joined the lessons when she could, though her duties in the big house made attendance dangerous. She worked as Harrison's personal servant, cleaning his study, serving his meals, and listening to conversations he assumed she couldn't understand. She began to notice things: how Harrison struggled with his own reading, how he relied on his overseer to handle correspondence, how his business dealings were slowly failing due to his poor judgment and worse temper. Samuel learned that Harrison owed significant debts to northern creditors, that the plantation was mortgaged beyond its value, and that the master's drinking had worsened since his wife's death the previous spring. Each piece of information was another tool in Samuel's growing arsenal, though he wasn't yet sure how to use them. But Mama Celia had taught him patience, along with literacy. And Samuel was learning to think in years rather than days. By winter, Samuel could read well enough to understand the legal documents that Ruth smuggled from Harrison's desk. He discovered that several enslaved people on neighboring plantations had purchased their freedom through a complex arrangement of loans and labor contracts. More importantly, he learned that Harrison's financial desperation was making him careless with paperwork, often signing documents without reading them thoroughly. Samuel began his most dangerous gambit, forging freedom papers. Using skills learned from copying Bible verses in Mama Celia's cellar, he practiced Harrison's signature until he could reproduce it perfectly. He studied the legal language of manumission documents, memorizing the precise phrases that transformed human property into free citizens. The work was painstaking, done in stolen moments when Harrison was away from the plantation or passed out drunk in his study. Ruth became his accomplice, only providing paper, ink, and crucial intelligence about Harrison's schedule and state of mind. She also began subtly encouraging Harrison's drinking, ensuring his evening whiskey glass never emptied, knowing that his judgment grew cloudier with each sip. Samuel understood that they were walking a tightrope over an abyss. That discovery would mean not just death, but torture designed to serve as an example to every other enslaved person who dared dream of freedom. The first document Samuel forged was a bill of sale, supposedly transferring ownership of himself to a fictitious northern merchant. The second was a manumission paper, dated 6 months in the future, that would legally free him upon completion of additional labor. Both documents bore Harrison's forged signature and official-looking seals that Samuel had carved from stolen wax. The papers were crude by legal standards, but they would pass casual inspection, especially if presented confidently to officials who rarely questioned the word of a white man. Spring brought new opportunities as Harrison's financial situation deteriorated further. Samuel had learned enough about the plantation's books to understand that Harrison was systematically selling off enslaved people to pay debts, breaking up families without regard for the human cost. This knowledge filled Samuel with cold rage, but also strategic opportunity. If Harrison was already selling people, Samuel reasoned, one more transaction might pass unnoticed. Samuel's plan required perfect timing and considerable risk. He waited until Harrison was scheduled to travel to Richmond for a creditors' meeting, a journey that would keep him away for several days. During Harrison's absence, Samuel would present his forged papers to the local magistrate, claiming that Harrison had sold him to the northern merchant before departing. The story was plausible enough to buy time, and time was all Samuel needed to disappear into the Underground Railroad network that Mama Celia had described in whispered conversations. Ruth's role was crucial but heartbreaking. She would remain behind with Moses, maintaining the illusion of normalcy until Samuel could establish himself in the north and send for them. The separation felt like death, but both understood that a failed escape attempt would doom all three of them. Samuel spent his last nights on the plantation memorizing every detail of his wife's face, every inflection of his son's voice, storing these memories against the possibility that he might never see them again. The morning of Harrison's departure, Samuel watched from the fields as the master's carriage rolled down the dusty road toward Richmond. That afternoon, Samuel bathed carefully, dressed in his cleanest clothes, and walked the 5 miles to town carrying his forged papers and a heart full of desperate hope. He had transformed himself from illiterate field hand to literate freeman through sheer force of will. But the most dangerous part of his journey was just beginning. The magistrate's office smelled of tobacco smoke and legal parchment, its walls lined with law books that Samuel could now read but dared not touch. Magistrate Coleman was documents with the careful deference expected of a newly freed man, his hands steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. Coleman examined the papers with perfunctory attention, more concerned with completing the transaction quickly than scrutinizing the details. Samuel had gambled correctly that the magistrate's casual racism would work in his favor. Coleman saw what he expected to see, a simple property transfer involving human chattel, and asked few questions. The forged signature passed inspection, the legal language appeared correct, and the story of a debt-ridden planter selling assets before fleeing creditors was entirely believable. Within an hour, Samuel walked out of the courthouse carrying legitimate freedom papers that transformed his forgeries into legal reality. The irony was not lost on him that Harrison's own signature, reproduced through stolen literacy, had become the key to Samuel's liberation. But freedom papers were only the beginning. Samuel still needed to reach the Underground Railroad network before Harrison returned and discovered the deception. Samuel spent that night in the woods outside town, nay, afraid to seek shelter that might require explanation of his presence. He had studied maps in Harrison's study and knew that the nearest Underground Railroad station was a 2-day walk north, but the journey would take him through territory where any black person traveling alone would attract dangerous attention. As dawn broke, Samuel began walking toward a freedom that felt simultaneously within reach and impossibly distant, and carrying nothing but his forged papers and the education that had made his escape possible. Harrison discovered Samuel's disappearance on the 3rd day after his return from Richmond, when the field overseer reported that the enslaved man had not appeared for work. The initial assumption was that Samuel had run away in the traditional sense, a desperate flight that would end in capture, punishment, and return. But when Harrison checked his study and found documents missing, along with evidence that his desk had been searched, a more chilling possibility emerged. The revelation that Samuel could read and write hit Harrison like a physical blow. He remembered the alphabet scratched in the dirt, the defiant silence during the whipping, the intelligence that had always lurked behind Samuel's careful subservience. Harrison realized that he had been living with an enemy who had been studying him, learning his weaknesses, preparing for this moment. The thought that an enslaved person had outwitted him, had used Harrison's own signature against him, filled the master with a rage that bordered on madness. Harrison's investigation revealed the full scope of the deception. Ruth, under brutal questioning, admitted to helping Samuel access the study, but claimed ignorance of his specific plans. The discovery of Mama Celia's night school led to savage punishments for everyone involved, but the damage was already done. Samuel had vanished into the Underground Railroad network, his trail cold and his freedom papers legally unassailable. The financial and psychological impact of Samuel's escape destroyed what remained of Harrison's stability. He had lost not just valuable property, but his sense of control over his own domain. The knowledge that Samuel was free, that the enslaved man had used literacy as a weapon against his former master, ate at Harrison like a cancer. Within 6 months, Harrison's drinking had progressed from heavy to suicidal. His plantation had fallen into foreclosure, and his reputation in the community had crumbled. Samuel's education had indeed destroyed his master, just as surely as any physical weapon could have. 2 years later, a letter arrived at the ruins of Harrison's plantation, addressed to Ruth and Moses, who had been sold to pay the master's debts. The letter was written in Samuel's careful handwriting, now confident and flowing, and it contained money for their passage north, along with detailed instructions for reaching him in Philadelphia. Samuel had found work as a teacher in a school for formerly enslaved children, using the literacy that had cost him so much blood to help others claim their own freedom through education. Harrison, now a broken man living in a single room above a tavern, heard about the letter from the plantation's new owner. The knowledge that Samuel was not just free, but thriving, and that he was teaching other black children to read and write, was the final blow to Harrison's shattered psyche. The master, who had once wielded absolute power over human lives, had been reduced to poverty and alcoholism by an enslaved man who had learned to wield words like weapons. Ruth and Moses made the journey north that autumn, following the same Underground Railroad network that had carried Samuel to freedom. Their reunion in Philadelphia was witnessed by dozens of formerly enslaved people who had heard Samuel's story and understood its significance. Samuel had proven that education was indeed the pathway from slavery to freedom, that knowledge could break chains no blacksmith had ever forged. Years later, Samuel would write a memoir of his experiences, adding his voice to the growing chorus of formerly enslaved people whose stories challenged America's conscience. But on that October evening in Philadelphia, as he held his wife and son for the first time in 2 years, Samuel's victory was complete. He had learned to read in secret, and he had used every word to destroy the man who had tried to keep him in darkness. The whipping post had broken his body, but it had not broken his spirit, and in the end, that had made all the difference. Subscribe for more untold stories of resilience, justice, and the people history tried to erase. Like this video if this story deserved to be told.